At its height, the Mali Empire controlled more than half of the world's known gold supply. It ran a network of universities whose libraries held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Its capital city was, by the accounts of travelers who visited it, one of the most orderly and prosperous places on Earth. This was not a small regional kingdom. This was one of the most powerful states in the 14th century world. Documented in Arabic, documented in Egyptian records, documented by European cartographers who drew its ruler on their maps with a crown and a gold nugget in each hand. You were never taught this, not because the evidence is thin, not because scholars haven't studied it. The Mali Empire is extensively documented. The reason you weren't taught it is more deliberate than that. And this video is about that deliberateness. Specifically, which textbook editors made which decisions, which colonial-era historians dismissed which sources, and which academic institutions chose for nearly 2 centuries to define African history as history without states. That is the question this video is going to answer. Not why Africa was overlooked, why Mali specifically, documented, mapped, attested, was removed from the story of the world you were handed in school. To understand how that erasure was constructed, you first need to understand what was actually there. The Mali Empire emerged in the early 13th century from the wreckage of the Ghana Empire, which had collapsed under the pressure of the Almoravid invasions and internal fragmentation. Its founder was a man named Sundiata Keita, a figure documented in both oral tradition and in the written accounts of Ibn Khaldun, the Tunisian historian who compiled historical records across the 14th century with a methodological rigor that historians still cite today. According to Ibn Khaldun's documentation, Sundiata defeated the Soso king Sumanguru Kante at the Battle of Kirina around 1235, and in doing so consolidated the regional chieftaincies of the upper Niger River Valley into a single administrative state. What Sundiata built was not a loose confederation of tribute relationships. It was a state. It had provinces administered by governors called farans. It had a standing army. It had standardized trade routes protected by that army. It had a court with documented protocols. The historian Nehemiah Levtzion, writing in his 1973 study, Ancient Ghana and Mali, described the Malian state structure as one of the most sophisticated administrative systems in the medieval world, comparable in organizational complexity to the contemporary kingdoms of Western Europe, and in many respects exceeding them. Levtzion was not writing polemically. He was comparing documented administrative records. The records supported the comparison. Within a century of its founding, Mali had grown to cover an area roughly equivalent to Western Europe. It stretched from the Atlantic coast of what is now Senegal and Gambia in the west to the Great Bend of the Niger River in the east, encompassing present-day Guinea, Sierra Leone, Senegal, Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, the Gambia River Valley, and substantial portions of modern Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. The population under its administration is estimated by scholars at somewhere between 8 and 14 million people, making it one of the most populous states on Earth at the time. That is not a footnote civilization. That is a major world power, and it was only getting started. The wealth of the Mali Empire was not mythological. It was geological. The empire sat atop 2 of the most productive gold-producing regions in the medieval world, the Bambuk goldfields, located at the confluence of the Senegal and Falémé rivers, and the Bure goldfields further east along the Niger. These fields produced, at the empire's peak, an estimated half of the world's total gold output. The historian, Roland Oliver, writing in the Cambridge History of Africa, estimated that by the early 14th century, The Mali Empire was responsible for roughly 2/3 of the gold circulating in the Mediterranean trade system. European merchants, North African traders, and Middle Eastern financiers were all, at some level, downstream of Mali. Think about what that means practically. The gold in the coins being traded in Venice, the gold in the jewelry worn in Cairo, the gold in the church ornaments of 14th century France. Much of it passed through, or originated in, the territory of a West African empire that was never mentioned in the history curriculum those same countries would later impose on the world. The gold did not move by accident. It moved along trade routes that the Mali Empire maintained with deliberate administrative effort. Salt from the Saharan mines at Tagaza moved south. Gold and kola nuts moved north. The exchange happened at Malian market towns, Djenné, Niani, Timbuktu, each of which functioned as a regulated commercial hub with documented customs procedures, standardized weights, and a professional merchant class whose operations the Arab geographer al-Bakri had begun documenting as early as the 11th century. The empire didn't just produce wealth. It organized it, taxed it, and protected it. That requires a state. Mali was a state. But the wealth was only one dimension of what was built here. Because if the Mali Empire had only been rich, it might have been dismissed as a fortunate geography. What made it categorically threatening to the historical narrative that Europe would later construct about Africa was what the empire did with its resources, what it invested in, what it built. Picture this. It is the year 1307. A man named Musa Keita, who will become known to history as Mansa Musa, meaning King of Kings, is about to ascend to the throne of the Mali Empire. He inherits a state already wealthy, already administratively sophisticated, already spanning an area the size of a continent. Over the next 25 years, he will transform it into something that has no comparison in the 14th century world. The geographer al-Umari, who spent years in Cairo interviewing people who had witnessed Mansa Musa's reign firsthand, described a ruler who combined military power, religious devotion, architectural ambition, and an appetite for scholarship that he turned into policy. This is not legend. Al-Umari completed his account, titled Masalik al-Absar fi Mamalik al-Amsar, around 1337, close enough to the events to draw on living testimony. Mansa Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 is the moment most often cited when Mali is mentioned at all, usually framed as a colorful anecdote about a very rich man. What is almost never taught is what the pilgrimage actually reveals about the state behind it. Musa departed Niani with a retinue of 60,000 people, 12,000 enslaved attendants, each carrying 4 pounds of gold bars, 10,000 soldiers, hundreds of camels each carrying 300 pounds of gold, and a diplomatic and scholarly entourage whose composition tells you that this was not a procession of wealth alone. It was a statement of statehood. It was a mobile embassy crossing the Sahara and the Middle East, demonstrating to every power it encountered that Mali was a player on the world stage. When Musa arrived in Cairo, he distributed gold so freely and in such quantities that al-Umari documented what happened next with the precision of an economist. The price of gold across the entire Eastern Mediterranean collapsed. Gold inflation, driven by this single man's generosity across a single journey, persisted in Egypt and the surrounding regions for 12 years after Musa left. 12 years. The economies of multiple states were structurally altered by one West African ruler passing through on his way to Mecca. What strikes me about this is not the scale of the gold. It's what it tells you about the scale of what was behind it. An empire that could absorb the loss of that much gold and continue functioning, continue taxing, continue trading, continue building, was not a kingdom living on surplus. It was an economic engine of genuine magnitude. Once that engine was documented, The documentation survived, and it still didn't reach most of the people who studied history in the 20th century. If you went to school in the United States, the United Kingdom, France, or most of the Anglophone and Francophone world, here is what you were likely taught about Africa in the medieval period. Not much. Perhaps a mention of ancient Egypt, which is typically taught as if it exists separately from the African continent. Perhaps a reference to the slave trade, which begins somewhere in the 16th century in most curricula, as if African history begins at the moment of European contact. The centuries between, the 1,000 years during which some of the most sophisticated states in the world were operating in West, East, and Central Africa, are, in the standard curriculum, a blank. And this is not an accident of evidence. The evidence exists. The blank was constructed. The construction happened in several documented phases. The first was the colonial era classification of African political history as primitive or pre-political. The British historian Hugh Trevor Roper, Regius Professor of Modern History at Oxford, one of the most prestigious academic positions in the English-speaking world, stated explicitly in a 1963 lecture that Africa had no history worth studying before European contact. Only the unedifying gyrations of barbarous tribes. That statement was made in 1963. It was made by the person holding one of the highest chairs in historical scholarship in Britain, and it reflected a consensus that had been building in European academic institutions since the 19th century. A consensus that shaped what went into textbooks, what was funded in universities, and what was considered worthy of scholarly attention. The second phase was the active dismissal of Arabic language primary sources. The historians who documented the Mali Empire, Ibn Battuta, who visited in 1352 and spent months at the Malian court. Ibn Khaldun, who compiled the empire's history from multiple sources. Al-Umari, who gathered eyewitness testimony, wrote in Arabic. European academic historiography, particularly in its 19th century institutionalized form, treated Arabic language sources about sub-Saharan Africa as secondary, as unreliable, or as simply outside the canon of legitimate history. The systematic non-translation of these sources into European languages meant that the documentation of Mali's sophistication remained inaccessible to most Western-educated students and scholars for generations. Not because it didn't exist, because no one with institutional funding chose to make it accessible. The third phase was textbook selection politics. In the post-war period, as the curriculum of history education in the United States and Britain was being standardized across public school systems, the textbook commissioning process was dominated by a small number of publishers whose editorial standards reflected the existing historiographical consensus. A study by the historian John Thornton, conducted in the 1980s and published in his landmark 1992 work, Africa and Africans in the Making of the Atlantic World, traced how African civilizations were systematically excluded from world history curricula at precisely the moment when those curricula were being formalized. The exclusion was not a passive omission. It was the result of active editorial decisions made by people who had absorbed the colonial era framework as the baseline of legitimate knowledge. So let's correct the record. The second pillar of the Mali Empire's greatness, and the dimension of its achievement most deliberately obscured, was not its wealth. It was its intellectual infrastructure. Timbuktu is a name most people in the Western world recognize, usually deployed as a joke, shorthand for somewhere impossibly remote. The irony of that usage is almost surgical in its precision, because in the 14th and 15th centuries, Timbuktu was not remote, like it was a center of the known world. It sat at the intersection of the trans-Saharan trade routes and the Niger River system, making it one of the most connected commercial and intellectual hubs on Earth. Merchants, scholars, pilgrims, and diplomats moved through it continuously. The intellectual life of Timbuktu was not informal, it was institutional. The city housed three major mosques, Jinguereber, Sankora, and Sidi Yahya, each of which functioned as an educational institution attached to a mosque in the tradition of Islamic scholarship. The Sankore Mosque and its associated madrasas functioned at the empire's peak as what we would today call a university. The historian Elias Saad, in his 1983 work Social History of Timbuktu, estimated that at its peak, the Sankora hosted between 25,000 and 30,000 students in a city of approximately 100,000 people. 1 in 4 residents was a student or scholar. Oxford University was formally established in 1096, a date the Western educational tradition treats as a founding moment of organized higher learning. Sankore had been operating in institutional form since at least the late 11th century, and reached its full scholarly capacity under the Mali Empire in the 13th and 14th centuries. It predates Oxford. It operated at comparable scale, and it covered comparable intellectual ground: theology, law, logic, rhetoric, astronomy, mathematics, medicine. The manuscripts produced and collected in Timbuktu's libraries numbered by conservative scholarly estimates somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000. The historian John Hunwick, who spent decades cataloging the Timbuktu manuscript collections and published his findings through the University of Illinois Press across the 1990s and early 2000s, documented texts covering Islamic jurisprudence, Quranic exegesis, Arabic poetry, history, astronomy, botany, and music theory. These were not primitive texts. They were contributions to the same intellectual traditions that Europe claims as the foundation of modern scholarship. Picture a library, not a modest one. A collection so large that when scholars finally began systematically cataloging what remained in the 20th century, after centuries of war, conquest, climate damage, and deliberate destruction, they still found enough surviving manuscripts to fill multiple major archive collections. What they cataloged was the remnant. The library, at its peak, was larger than anything in contemporary Europe, and it was built in West Africa, in a city most people today use as a punchline. You are asked in school to memorize the founding dates of European universities. You are rarely asked to consider that contemporaneous institutions of equivalent scale existed in Africa, and that those institutions were simply removed from the curriculum. What Sankore represented was not just scholarship, it was proof. Proof that the narrative of African intellectual incapacity, the narrative that would be deployed to justify the transatlantic slave trade, to justify colonialism, to justify a century of academic dismissal, was, at the moment of its construction, already contradicted by documented historical reality. The people who built the colonial historical framework knew the Arabic sources existed. Some of them had read them. They chose to exclude them anyway. And that choice, made in European universities and government offices, shaped what you were handed as the history of the world. This is not a theory. The exclusion is documented. The decisions are traceable. The people who made them left records. But the intellectual achievement of the Mali Empire, extraordinary as it was, is still not the most dangerous part of this story. The most dangerous part is what the empire was in political terms, and what that political reality threatened. Because the Mali Empire was not only sophisticated, it was stable, and it was self-sufficient. And for the narrative of European expansion that would be constructed over the next 3 centuries, nothing was more inconvenient than a large, stable, self-sufficient African state. The third pillar of the Mali Empire is its political and military structure. and the way that structure was deliberately written out of the account of what Africa was before European contact. Ibn Battuta arrived at the court of Mali in 1352, roughly 2 decades after Mansa Musa's death, and spent 8 months observing the operation of the Malian state. His account, the Rihla, is one of the most detailed eyewitness descriptions of a medieval African polity ever produced. What Ibn Battuta documented was not a tribal chieftaincy. It was a functioning state with formal court protocols, a professional judiciary that operated according to Islamic legal standards, a system of public order that Ibn Battuta explicitly compared favorably to the states of North Africa and the Middle East, and a culture of personal security for travelers that he described as exceptional by any standard he had encountered anywhere in his 30 years of documented global travel. Ibn Battuta wrote that no people are further from injustice than the people of Mali. He wrote that travelers throughout the empire felt safe from theft. He described public court proceedings conducted with procedural regularity. He noted the existence of a professional class of scholars and administrators whose positions were hereditary and whose training was formalized. This was, in Ibn Battuta's direct and documented assessment, a well-governed state. The military infrastructure that maintained that governance was correspondingly substantial. The historian D.T. Nyan, in his 1984 contribution to UNESCO's General History of Africa, estimated the standing army of the Mali Empire at its peak at approximately 100,000 soldiers, including cavalry units that operated across the Sahel with a logistical sophistication that required stable supply lines, disciplined command structures, and the capacity to project force across enormous distances. The empire's military power was the reason its trade routes functioned. It was the reason that merchants from Morocco to Egypt operated within Malian commercial frameworks. The protection of trade was not incidental. It was policy. What the Mali Empire's political structure demonstrates, what it proves with documentation in primary sources, is that the claim of a pre-colonial Africa characterized by statelessness, beset by the absence of organized governance, by political primitivism, is not a conclusion drawn from evidence. It is a claim that required the systematic suppression of evidence to sustain. That suppression was performed by real people with real institutional authority, in the service of a political project whose consequences are still felt today. I want to be precise about what I mean by that. I am not arguing that European historians of the 19th century were uniquely evil. I am arguing that they operated within an institutional framework that had material incentives to deny African political sophistication, and that those institutional incentives shaped which evidence was admitted, which sources were translated, which conclusions were considered legitimate. That framework persisted in the Western academic mainstream for over a century. Its residue is in every curriculum that treats African history as beginning with the slave trade. The Mali Empire declined not through internal collapse, but through a series of compounding external pressures. Mansa Musa died around 1337, and the succession that followed was unstable. Multiple rulers over a short period weakened the administrative coherence that had held the empire together. The Tuareg Berber peoples to the north began raiding the empire's northern territories in the early 15th century. Most consequentially, the Songhai Empire, itself centered on the Niger Bend, expanded westward under Sunni Ali in the 1460s and captured Timbuktu in 1468, effectively ending Malian control over its eastern commercial and intellectual heartlands. By 1500, what had been the most powerful state in the 14th century world had contracted to a regional fragment of its former territory. But here is what matters for understanding the erasure. The Mali Empire's decline happened before sustained European contact with West Africa's interior. The Portuguese were navigating the West African coast from the mid-15th century, but the interior remained largely inaccessible to European observation until much later. What this means is that the diminished post-imperial Mali that later European travelers and colonial administrators encountered was not the Mali of Mansa Musa. It was not the Mali of Sankori's 30,000 students. It was not the Mali that Ibn Battuta had described with admiration, and it was the aftermath of an imperial collapse. And European observers interpreted that aftermath as the natural, original condition of the region. The historian Walter Rodney, in his 1972 work, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, documented this interpretive slight in precise terms. The declining successor states of former African empires were encountered by European observers during the specific historical window of their maximum weakness. And those observers then retroactively defined that weakness as the African norm. The documentation that showed what Africa had been before that window, the Arabic sources, the court records, the geographic surveys of al-Bakri and al-Idrisi, was not consulted, not translated, not integrated. The weakness was what was seen. The weakness was what was recorded. The strength was what was buried. The trade routes that Mansa Musa's empire controlled, the north-south corridor of the Trans-Saharan network, the east-west axis of the Niger River system, did not disappear with the empire. They were inherited, first by the Songhai Empire, which built its own extraordinary civilization on the infrastructure Mali had developed. Then, as the Moroccan invasion of 1591 destroyed the Songhai state, by a fragmented network of successor trading communities that European powers would encounter, exploit, and eventually restructure into the logistics of the transatlantic slave trade. This is not metaphor. The geographic corridors that made Mali wealthy, the same river systems, the same Saharan crossing points, the same coastal access routes, are the corridors that would define the geography of extraction over the following 3 centuries. The wealth that moved through Mali before 1500 became the structural template for the wealth that moved through those same regions after European commercial penetration. What Europe called discovery was, in most cases, the appropriation of existing infrastructure built by the civilizations it was simultaneously claiming had never built anything. The Timbuktu manuscripts, the surviving remnant of what was once the world's largest library collection in a non-European city, still exist. They are housed today in archives in Timbuktu, in Bamako, in libraries in Morocco, and across the diaspora of Malian scholarship. The Ahmed Baba Institute in Timbuktu are named after one of the Mali Empire's most prolific scholars, who was forcibly relocated to Morocco after the 1591 Moroccan invasion, but continued writing and teaching there until his death in 1627. Holds over 25,000 manuscripts by itself. That is the remnant. We are arguing about the remnant. The modern Republic of Mali, established in 1960 upon independence from France, inherited not only the geographic footprint of a colonial administrative unit, but also the erasure of the historical identity that preceded colonialism. The French colonial project in the region had operated under the same intellectual framework that British and other colonial administrations applied elsewhere. That the territory had no significant pre-colonial political or intellectual history worth preserving or teaching, where the textbooks written in the colonial period were not corrected upon independence. They were, in many cases, simply translated. The curriculum that French children were taught about Africa, the curriculum that defined Africa as a place where history arrived with Europe, was, in modified form, the curriculum that children in post-colonial Mali were also taught. That is not incidental. That is the structure of how erasure reproduces itself. It is not enough to end political colonization if the epistemological infrastructure of colonization remains intact. The mechanism that buried the Mali Empire did not require ongoing active suppression. It required only that the framework it established be treated as the default, the baseline, the neutral starting point from which scholarship proceeded. And for most of the 20th century, that is exactly what happened. The scholars who have worked to recover the history of the Mali Empire, Nehemiah Levtzion, John Hunwick, D.T. Niane, Elias Saad, John Thornton, Ivor Wilkes, did so against the grain of an academic mainstream that treated their subject as marginal. The fact that we now have a reasonably detailed picture of what the Mali Empire was is a function of their effort and of the preservation of Arabic language sources that colonial-era historiography never systematically engaged. The recovery is not complete. The manuscripts still being cataloged in Timbuktu, many of them damaged, some of them recently endangered by extremist groups who attacked the city in 2012 and 2013, requiring emergency evacuations of archival materials, may contain historical information that has not yet been read by any scholar alive today. Think about that. There are manuscripts in Timbuktu that have not been read since the scholars who wrote them died. In them may be records of the Mali Empire, administrative documents, legal decisions, commercial records, astronomical observations that would add further dimension to what we already know. The library is still being uncovered, history is still being recovered, and the reason it needs recovering is that it was deliberately left behind. We began this video with a question, not a rhetorical one, a specific question with a specific answer. How does a civilization this documented, this attested, this present in primary sources across multiple languages and geographies, who disappear from the textbooks that educated the majority of the world's English-speaking students across the 20th century? The answer is that it does not disappear. It is removed by specific people making specific decisions in specific institutions with specific interests. Hugh Trevor Roper from his Oxford chair. Textbook editors choosing which civilizations merited chapters and which did not. Curriculum committees in state school systems across the United States and Britain who treated a consensus built on colonial assumptions as the neutral baseline of knowledge. The disappearance of the Mali Empire from your education was not an oversight. It was an outcome. What you now know, that most people who went to school alongside you were never told, is that the 14th century world contained a West African state that controlled more gold than any other entity on Earth, ran universities at a scale that rivaled and in some cases predated the institutions Europe would later claim as the foundations of civilization, was governed with a sophistication that eyewitnesses from 3 continents documented with admiration, and whose trade infrastructure shaped the geography of wealth and exploitation for centuries after its decline. That story was in the archives the entire time. If there is a civilization or a figure that you think history buried even deeper than this, tell me in the comments. I read every one, and the next video I make may be the one you mention. Next, she defeated Portugal. History forgot to tell you. The empire was real. The erasure was a choice.